Welcome back. This is the last video in chapter 3 and its subject is Kurosawa Kiyoshi, a Japanese film director who began creating some unique horror films around the time that J-horror gained momentum. Of course, when it comes to the topic of Japanese horror directors with a unique style, there are quite a few that I could have made a separate video about, but I chose Kurosawa Kiyoshi because what makes his horror movies so special is the often weird, unsettling, and downright uncanny atmosphere that you can find in some of them, which makes them a perfect fit for our video series. Let's begin. The main attraction of this video will of course be Kurosawa Kiyoshi's horror films, but you may be surprised to learn that his debut as a director was a Japanese softcore porn movie which he was asked to direct for the independent Studio Million film in the 1980s. Kurosawa Kiyoshi took the job, but the result, called Kandagawa Inran Senso, which in English means Kandagawa Pervert Wars, released in 1983, would already show that he wasn't exactly your standard run-of-the-mill director, because although the film did have sexual content, it was anything but a simple erotic movie. I haven't seen it myself, but from what I've read, it supposedly was more of a bizarre and unconventional comedy that even contained references to Alfred Hitchcock's film Rear Window from 1954 and American Western movies. Well, it seems that the studio was not too fond of that, which is probably not all that surprising, and so his next project, another erotic film titled Joshi Daisei Hazukashi Seminaru, an English translation would be College Girl Shameful Seminar, was eventually deemed not sexy enough and therefore cancelled. However, instead of giving up on the film completely, Kurosawa Kiyoshi acquired the existing footage, removed most of the erotic parts, shot some more scenes, and turned it into a weird comedy film called Doremifa Musume no Chi wa Sawagu, which could be translated as The Excitement of the Doremifa Girl, although the worldwide English title seems to be Bumpkin Soup. This movie was released in 1985. And then, in 1989, he finally had his major debut when he wrote and directed the horror movie Sweet Home, which means Sweet Home. It was produced by Itami Juzo and distributed by Film Studio Toho. The film contains some splatter sequences with effects that were actually done by American special makeup effect artist Dick Smith, who had also worked on The Exorcist. And the fact that this film from the 1980s contained such elements certainly fits into the development we've learned about in previous videos. But it also contained some classical Japanese elements, such as a female vengeful spirit. Now, this movie will actually be relevant again when we talk about Japanese video games, so try to keep it in the back of your mind. After Sweet Home, Kurosawa mainly worked on some V-cinema pieces. As mentioned in the previous video, he was also one of the directors that worked on the Gakkou no Kaidan franchise. But in 1997, he released Cure, the first in a series of films that earned him international attention, and also the first of the films that I want to properly discuss in this video. Cure is basically a psychological thriller, but you could also call it a horror film, despite the absence of any clearly paranormal elements. The story centers around the relationship between its protagonist Takabe Kenichi, a police officer, and the antagonist Mamiya, a mysterious serial killer, although it doesn't even feel entirely accurate to call him that, since Mamiya never directly kills anyone. It seems more like his mere words and presence are capable of causing others to murder someone, without even knowing why they did it. Of course, there's more to the plot, but I don't want to spoil it for those who are interested in watching it themselves. Given this premise, one might be tempted to see in Cure a Japanese version of serial killer movies like Silence of the Lambs or Seven at first glance, which would certainly not be a bad thing, both are great movies. If you take a closer look though, you will realize that Cure, with its particular visual aesthetic, its fair share of uncanny and discomforting scenes, and its mysterious plot and ambiguous ending, has a lot more in common with the similarly atmospheric and often confusing works of American director David Lynch, whose films can, at times, even feel like you're not supposed to understand them entirely and seem more like an intentional but fascinating deconstruction of conventional narrative structures. Now, of course, I'm not going to talk about Cure without showing you any examples, so let me begin with this clip that contains the first appearance of the mysterious antagonist Mamiya in the film. Strictly speaking, the scene just depicts a windy day at the beach and a person walking towards the camera, but the wide shot and unsettling ambient music immediately create a sense of foreboding. One characteristic of Cure and some other films by Kurosawa Kiyoshi is its frequent use of wide spaces. The beach scene already demonstrated this, but I'll give you another example.
自分がやったことは全部覚えています。確かに僕が智子を殺しました。あの時は焦るのが当然だと思ったんです。
Also note how the diagonal line of the wall on the right is somewhat mirrored by the beds and stools on the left. The way the whole shot is framed almost makes it look like a gloomy painting. There's just a certain aesthetic to this shot that you can actually find in many scenes of Kurosawa Kiyoshi's movies. In general, Kurosawa Kiyoshi uses a lot of symmetry and clear lines in Cure, which is most likely a contributing factor to the picturesque quality of these scenes. Take a look at this, for example. Or this. Or this.
深入りしすぎるなよ、人の心に。
I could go on.
仕事が落ち着いたら迎えに来ますから。わかりました。
But I think you get the picture. The symmetry, however, isn't always, well, truly symmetrical. There are quite a few shots where it would be more appropriate to say that they could have been symmetrical if it weren't for the perspective being slightly off. This, however, helps create a certain visual sense of unease. It should be noted that this use of straight lines and symmetry or almost symmetrical perspectives can also be found in other works from Kurosawa Kiyoshi, but it feels especially fitting in Cure, as one of the movie's main themes is the protagonist Takabe Kenichi's struggle to understand the human psyche and, in particular, the psyche of criminals. He wants to be able to understand what drives perpetrators to do whatever they did. In other words, he's always searching for order, and things like straight lines and symmetry could certainly be seen as a visual representation of balance and order.
犯罪の動機なんてのは、所詮他人にはわからん。時に本人にもな。ってことはつまり誰にもわからんってことだ。深入りしすぎるなよ、人の心に。そんなつもりはない。俺はただ犯罪を説明する言葉を探してる。それが俺の仕事だ。
It's probably also this character trait of protagonist Takabe Kenichi that causes him to be both fascinated and increasingly irritated by the mysterious and chaotic Mamiya, who seems to defy any idea of balance and order with his completely erratic behavior, and who is actually capable of forcing total strangers to commit horrible murders for which they had no reason at all, leaving them completely shocked and confused afterwards.
理由はありません。
Finally, before we move on to the next movie, here's one more example from Cure that demonstrates once again Kurosawa Kiyoshi's use of wide spaces, interesting perspectives, and his general ability to create an extremely unsettling and uncanny atmosphere. Moving on, another film from Kurosawa Kiyoshi that I would like to discuss is Kairo from 2001. The title could be translated as Circuit, although the official English title is actually Pulse. And this one is a proper paranormal horror film, and one of his masterpieces as far as I'm concerned. At its core, it's also a psychological film that deals with topics like loneliness, human relationships, desperate attempts at connecting with other people, and the general fear of isolation. These themes are cleverly reflected in the camera work, as the film very often shows characters that are spatially far apart from each other, uses wide shots that can easily evoke a feeling of loneliness and of being lost, or frequently frames characters in a way that suggests distance, separation, isolation, etc., for instance by filming them with some sort of barrier between the camera and the characters, such as a glass window. Or by utilizing literal distance and filming them from another room, from outside the house, and so on. This is definitely something that can be noticed throughout the entire film, and it's details like these that make watching Kairo all the more fascinating. There's a lot to unpack, both visually and thematically, and a lot of food for thought that ties in very well with all the scariness that the film has to offer, and boy does it have a lot of that as well. Now I don't know if you remember, but we actually briefly talked about Kairo when I showed you this ghost from the Hontoni Atta Kowai Hanashi short movie Natsu no Taikukan from 1991. Which is said to have inspired this ghost in Kurosawa Kiyoshi's Kairo. Which I still think is a pretty unnerving encounter, but here are a few more examples.
10年前、鹿児島県種子島の少年が海に流した手紙入りの瓶が今年になって4000キロ以上も離れたマレーシアトレガヌ州の海岸に流れ着いていたことが分かります。今年の夏の長期予報によりますと、東日本は3年連続で、西日本は6年連続で暑い夏になりそうです。また北に
私は幻ではない。
However, I don't even want to show too much here, so I'll just leave it at that and hope that I could inspire those of you who don't know this film to give it a try yourself. By the way, the first movies that Kurosawa Kiyoshi made back in the 1980s were probably already a good indicator of this, but Kurosawa Kiyoshi is not merely a director of horror films. There's Charisma from 1999, for instance, a deeply philosophical film, or Doppelganger from 2003, which does start out with some fairly creepy scenes, giving us the impression that we are indeed watching another Kurosawa Kiyoshi horror film. The film begins with a woman seeing her boyfriend at a home center, only to drive home and see him there as well, only to then receive a phone call saying that he was found dead, even though she just talked to him in the house, which is finally followed by this.
ちょっと待ってください。今本人に変わりますんで。たかし、ごめん、ちょっと出てくれる？変な電話なの。たかし。
There is also the following scene in which the protagonist, a scientist called Hayasaki, meets his doppelganger for the first time. Both are played by Yakuso Koji, by the way, who is the same actor that played the police officer in Cure and who appears in Kairo and many other Kurosawa Kiyoshi films. But shortly thereafter, the entire movie completely changes its tone and evolves into a very entertaining and bizarre black comedy. Just look, for instance, at this dialogue between Hayasaki and his doppelganger.
君は誰だ？
俺？お前だよ。
私は早崎道夫だ。
私も早崎道夫だ。
何をわけのわからんこと言ってるんだ。とにかく早く消えてくれ。
働きすぎだ。どうかしてる。
おい。何やってんだ。
幻聴だ。
In a way, you could even say that Kurosawa Kiyoshi himself acts as a duplicated character in this movie by structuring the film like this. It's almost like the beginning of the movie represents Kurosawa Kiyoshi as a director of horror movies, but then Kurosawa Kiyoshi's doppelganger takes over and just lets loose and goes wild, which is exactly what the protagonist's doppelganger in the movie does. Anyway, all comedy aside, the presence of a doppelganger in this film actually does tap into uncanny territory, and while I won't deny that first and foremost this movie is an extremely entertaining black comedy, I couldn't shake off a certain lingering feeling of uneasiness after my first view of it, as it makes you ponder what it would be like to be confronted with your own doppelganger. Furthermore, the doppelganger in this movie also corresponds to Sigmund Freud's definition of the uncanny. For Freud, the emergence of something repressed was the source of the uncanny. Freud also writes that a doppelganger can represent repressed urges, ambitions, etc. In light of this, it's quite fitting that protagonist Hayasaki's doppelganger acts out Hayasaki's suppressed anger, urges, and fantasies, and refuses to stop since Hayasaki refuses to accept him as a part of himself. But again, I don't want to spoil too much of the movie in case you haven't seen it yet, so this seems like a good point to end the discussion of Kurosawa's movie Doppelganger. It's also a good point to conclude this video. There are some more horror movies by Kurosawa Kiyoshi, but I think what has been said and shown thus far should suffice for the purpose of this video series and has hopefully given you a good idea of Kurosawa Kiyoshi's unique and often uncanny horror works. I will also conclude the entire chapter 3 now, a chapter that dealt with horror in Japanese cinema. I understand that this might feel a bit sudden, and there's still a lot more that could be said about various other Japanese horror movies from the past 2 decades, but once again please keep in mind that my graduation thesis on which this series is based was written in the years 2009 and 2010, so back then this was a great point to transition to the next chapter. In chapter 4, we will begin our journey into the horror that lurks within the world of Japanese video games. I hope you're looking forward to it, I certainly am. So see you there, and as always, take care and goodbye.